Are people, are countries where the majority is reliant on a universal basic income just to survive going to become more or less equal going forward? What happens to power? What happens to democracy? There are many, many questions that one can start to unpack with these concepts when we start to think a little bit more systemically rather than just about, yay, free money at the end of the month.
Universal basic income is an idea that is rapidly gaining in popularity. But what are the implications for the economy and also for society at large? My name is David Ansara, and we're joined today by Flux trends economist and futurist Bronwyn Williams. Bronwyn, help our viewers to understand this idea of a universal basic income. Is it achievable, and is it even desirable?
So universal basic income is interesting. It's one of those ideas that's time has very much come. It's gone from being a fringe idea to a mainstream idea globally very, very quickly. And it's quite an attractive idea. It tends to be premised on the concept of fully automated luxury communism, or sold in those sorts of terms. And it is both a sort of a reaction and a sort of proactive idea to try and deal with some of the biggest challenges in our times. The first one being, of course, massive inequality, which is growing. And the second one being the threat, which I'm not a huge supporter of, but it is a threat that many people have, of this idea that automation and technology is going to replace a lot of jobs. So the sort of fear that's selling and driving this desire for things like universal basic income comes from the idea that machines are going to take our jobs on the one hand. So how are we going to live as human beings? How are we going to add value to society? We're going to need some way to live, some sort of income in order to survive that. At the same time, it's sort of being sold from a more sort of greed or optimism-based sort of ideology to say, why should we work at all if machines can do all the work? Why can't we just live lives of luxury and leisure like the futurists of last century really spoke about? So it's both an attractive idea and a necessary idea, depending on which sort of people you speak to. And even from a libertarian perspective, there have been many sort of supporters of the idea in that a single basic income does reduce a lot of the dead weight loss that comes from messy welfare programs. So at its sort of simplest, universal basic income would be available to every citizen in the population and would replace all the different welfare entitlements that we've accumulated over our sort of long journey through democracy as Western nations over the last 100 or 200 years or so. So that's what it's sort of being sold as. But there are sort of some catches to this idea. First of all, how it is to be funded. Can machines really replace all the value of productivity that comes from labor and from human beings, sort of new creativity, coming up with new ideas to keep society progressing? But it's also a sort of more subtle problem that I have with the idea. And that's the concept that we're essentially telling people that they will never have enough worth to society to replace the value that they're going to be given in the form of that universal basic income. We're essentially telling people that they will not be able to add value to society, which is, I think, quite a dangerous idea. It's not advertised by proponents of the concept, but it's there in the subtext, this whole thing that you're never going to be able to earn your own living or to justify your own worth. You have to be a dependent on society. The other sort of dangerous idea that comes from this whole sort of you'll own nothing, but you'll be happy because don't worry, you'll get your universal basic income, be able to live. The other subtext there is to sort of who's actually funding this? And what it's really suggesting is that capital and that control over real assets will reside in the hands of the very, very few, whether those very, very few are capitalists or corporations or nation states. That's really what's being said, that very few hands, very powerful hands will own real resources and everyone else will get essentially a handout, which is obviously not great for power dynamics. It's not necessarily good for democracy, which is premised on people being able to essentially pay for their government rather than the government sort of paying them, which changes the whole sort of power dynamics there. But it's also a little bit concerning when you start layering it in with some of the other big ideas lying around, particularly those of things like what's going on in the cryptocurrency space and also the concepts of modern monetary theory and increasing the money supply and increasing control over how the physical and monetary components of economies work. Because when we start getting into sort of using inflation as a way to maintain your economy or having governments that have more control over monetary policy, it is essential, even by proponents of those sorts of ideas, that money that is injected into the economy is actually used to increase productivity. And of course, there's no guarantees that a population that is reliant on a universal basic income or some sort of grant or handout, whatever that may be, will translate into higher productivity growth. And if it doesn't, the risk then, of course, once again becomes the sort of threat of inflation, which many economists are quite worried about. But that's perhaps a little bit too much detail on that side. I think we do need to think very carefully about how these things are funded and how they are sustained and how we can avoid what I'm terming marginal fray, the whole sort of concept that when you start dishing out things like universal basic incomes to a population, you're effectively drawing a line across your population, along one side of which will be people that are net beneficiaries or net recipients of that universal basic income or that welfare payment, and on the other side of the line, people that are net funders of that. And the sort of danger with these sorts of systems, because of course, any sort of basic income never goes down, it only goes up. And every time it goes up, more people find themselves on the other side of the line. And taken to its logical conclusion, as I was speaking about earlier, you end up essentially with an economy where fewer and fewer people control more and more of the economy, and more people end up essentially dependents of that very small group. So I'm not convinced that projects like this will actually reduce inequality at the end of the day, if that is our goal, and that perhaps we need to ask a few more questions about not just the short-term benefits, because of course everyone would like some free money at the end of the month, but rather about the longer-term consequences. Are people, are countries where the majority is reliant on a universal basic income just to survive, going to become more or less equal going forward? What happens to power? What happens to democracy? There are many questions that one can start to unpack with these concepts when we start to think a little bit more systemically rather than just about, yay, free money at the end of the month.
Well, thanks very much, Bronwyn. I think that UBI will have significant implications for our economy and society more broadly. My name is David Ansara. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, check out the link in the description below to our 30-day free trial. Let us know what you think in the comments section. Is universal basic income desirable?